Welcome to the AI Corner. I'm your host, Mike Bagley, here to spotlight the people shaping New Zealand's AI future. In today's episode, we're speaking with Hitarth Sharma. Hitarth is a founding engineer at a stealth AI startup backed by OpenAI. He's led major initiatives at Afterpay and Paloma, building cutting-edge AI products, and Hitarth is super passionate about AI agents and long-term memory systems. Welcome to the pod, Hitarth.
Cheers, Mike. Good to be here.
Welcome. How did you get into the AI space? What first sparked your interest in working with LLMs? You've been an engineer your whole career, as I understand it.
Yeah, that's right. So I could have gone into the whole AI space earlier, but I think, so I started working about like 2013, 2012. And around 2014, I remember hearing like, oh, big data is like the next big thing and all that sort of stuff. And I was like, sweet, let me take a look. And I looked at it and it was all math. And I was like, yeah, I think I'll stick with like the JavaScript frameworks. So that was like my first mess. But then I think just probably a couple of weeks before ChatGPT got launched, somehow I stumbled upon, I think it was GPT-3 or maybe DaVinci, which was one of the earlier OpenAI models. And I remember stumbling across it, and they just had an API at that point. And I remember hitting that API with just the thing saying like, oh, create like the snake game. And I just got back code that I pasted into my IDE, and it worked. And that was like the first sort of like click that, holy shit. Because I've always like played around with things, and I've always tried making little things and that sort of stuff in my own time on the side. And one of the things that I always struggled with was like anything that I wanted to do, it needed to be like pre-2023, everything needed to be quite deterministic. So you needed to know what was it exactly that you needed to get from the user in order for the app to be able to do whatever it is that the user wanted it to do. And you had to kind of like carefully structure the pipeline and all that sort of stuff. And that was just, from my point of view, tedious work. Because I'm just one of those lazy engineer types. So basically, this was like the first moment where I was like, holy shit, like this whole natural language interface thing, this can actually work. Like this thing can understand what I mean by the snake game, and it creates that actual snake game instead of like, like snakes and ladders or some other thing, or just not knowing at all like what it is, right, that I'm talking about. And so from that point on is when I got really into it. I started posting about it in my work Slack and stuff, and basically no one cared. And then a couple of weeks later, ChatGPT dropped, and then everyone was like, holy shit, this is awesome.
Wow.
But then that sort of like, I think eventually the hype died down, but I kind of stuck to it. And so from that point on, I kept pushing just in my own side stuff, how I could use it, just trying to get a feel for things from a hands-on point of view. Because there was a lot of hype, especially when ChatGPT first came out, like, oh, this is going to change everything. And it is, but sometimes it's very, like, it's easy to get lost in the hype in terms of like what are the actual capabilities versus what it's going to be able to do in the next 5, 10, 20 years. A lot of marketing is sort of like looking at that 5, 10, 20 year sort of like mark, but a lot of the actual hands-on work that needs to happen today. The customers are waiting to be served today, right? We can't we can't give them those empty promises. So just trying to get a feel for exactly what the capabilities were, and the only way to do that was by actually playing around with it and building stuff. So yeah, that's kind of how it started.
You had a pretty early aha moment. And as you say, you're probably not a lazy engineer, probably just a super efficient one in some different way. How did you sort of move into AI projects? Was it just personal curiosity, or did you join a company that enabled you to really experiment and tinker in the space?
Yeah, so I was really lucky that I'd been at Paloma at that point for I think about 3-4 years. So I built up pretty good like social capital in the company, and I was also in a management role at that point in time. So that meant that there was always ups and downs. So like if it was crisis time, it was all hands on deck. But if it was like a peaceful sort of time, I actually just had some time on my hands, and I was pretty lucky that that was that period, because then I would just use my time kind of playing around with these tools and that sort of stuff. And like early on, a lot of my time at Paloma was spent working with Afterpay. And so initially, just like all big companies, they were just like, well, let's not touch this thing. Let's see what it does if it explodes. And once it doesn't for a while, then we'll get into it. So during that time, I kind of just kicked off my own side project. So one of the first things that I did was like, I'm really into working out and stuff like that. And one of the things I hated was, not hated, but essentially like I found tedious again, being lazy, was just coming up with the actual workouts. So I felt great after the workout, during the workout, but having to get started, that was sort of like, I just had to push through that. So I built like this really simple, classic like GPT wrapper, which was like, cool, here's my stats. I'm male, weight, height, whatever, blah, blah. Here's the equipment that I have. Here's the injuries that I have. Because at that time, I sort of like just turned 30, and I was like, ah, shit, my lower back, ah, my wrist, blah, blah. So yeah, so built a workout generator. And again, that was another point where I was like, shit, okay, so that wasn't a one-off, that moment that I had earlier with the snake game. This can actually work. And when I'm trying to do the workout, yeah, sometimes it spits out garbage, hallucinates. That was my first like meetings with the hallucinations, where it would just dream up these exercises. And I was like, I've been working out for a while. I'm pretty sure that is not a real exercise. But yeah, so went with that. And then from there on, like once you start playing around with it, then you start just getting tons of ideas, and you start noticing even in your day to day that like, oh, this is a bit frictiony, or oh, that's a bit annoying. Maybe I can do something with this. Maybe I can do something with that. So that's kind of how it went.
You're so right. It's almost everyone has a few of those moments in the early days of it hallucinates or it's a pretty crappy response, and the obvious is garbage in, garbage out, right? And then you learn pretty quickly how you can control it to give you the outputs you want, not overly deterministically, because you will still want to give it some creativity for some use cases, right? But I think a lot of people end up putting the technology in the drawer because of that first experience. And it's a classic, the builder blames their tools type of concept. And I think, even with the release of GPT-5, right, I think it's a good thing because it kind of raises the floor of the capability for everybody, because everyone has access to it through the free account, which means that error rate, I suppose, that people might perceive because the output wasn't great is going to be reducing over time. Like they've already shown that it is reductionist in its hallucination benchmarks and all the rest of it.
Yeah,
And
like
it's less of a yes man nowadays as well, which is also good. There will still be people who will find a problem with it and they won't adopt it for some time until it's perfect. But the challenge of waiting until it's perfect rather than getting curious and actually diving in and figuring out how you can control it a bit more is that you end up missing the hype, and you've lost all that time of really understanding how it works and trialing it in different ways and figuring out where it works into your workflows.
Yeah, man, 100%. Like, yeah, exactly. And I mean, I'm really glad you mentioned that point, because it's weird as well how people reacted to the hallucinations. Like some people saw the hallucinations, and as you said, they were just like, nah, not good, no good, just chuck it away. And then others like me were like, oh, cool, interesting, it hallucinates. Let's see what else it does. Right. And
Yeah.
so it's like those the two ways of looking at things, and you can go down either route. And yeah, as you said, like if you just kind of dismiss it, then you miss out on all that experience and building that sort of like intuition about what might work, what might not work, as opposed to just waiting for the perfect thing.
It's so true. There's almost curiosity leads to intuition through experience in some way, shape, or form. And I suppose you've probably spoken to a number of traditional engineers, let's call them, who haven't maybe jumped on the bandwagon or who didn't get on the hype train when you did. And even now they might just be becoming aware of the curses of the world or Replit. Like, how do you speak to those individuals? Do you try and convince them? Do you try and show them what is possible? Like, what sort of conversations do you have with the developer and the technical crowd?
Yeah, I think the pre-management me would have definitely tried like beating them over the head with it, be like, nah, you gotta use it, you should use it, blah, blah, blah. But I think over the years, as I've kind of like matured, I realized that work and tech and all that sort of stuff, that's just like it sometimes might feel like that's everything, but it's actually just a small part of our lives. And so like
True.
I work with a lot of like really good engineers who would just focus on work like during their 9 to 5, and that was it. So for those people, I understood that they were just like, cool, like if when this becomes big enough, I'm sure I'll hear more about it and it will be unavoidable, and then I'll jump onto it. Whereas there were people like me who had plenty of time on their hands who were just like, yeah, shit, like I'm ready to go. Like just give me something interesting, and this is something interesting, so let's jump onto it. But then there were other folks who were concerned about sort of like the environmental impacts of it and that sort of stuff. And so in Paloma, like I think near the end of my term, we started doing these AI office hours, and it was called like Last Month in AI or something like that. And so during that time, it was quite a nice thing where it was like an open forum, and we would actually have chats about this sort of stuff. And so it was quite good to hear things about from the other person, like other people's point of view. Because I think I was real, like just kind of like, I guess you call me an optimist, right? Like where I was just like, this is awesome. This is like the best thing, that's happened to the tech industry in like, I don't know how long since I've started working, blah, blah, blah. So it was good to see that, there's some potential downsides to it as well. And so I think in my experience, at least, by just having that conversation and not outright just dismissing people when they're like, but there's environmental impacts to it and that sort of stuff. I think you sort of like start to have a conversation, and then when they work with you, they're like, oh wow, you did this so much quicker. How did you do that? Well, I'm using Cursor, unlike you Neanderthals still using VS Code. So that sort of stuff. Like you can kind of like, in my case at least, I kind of like just joked around it, and then but like just based on experience, like most engineers that I worked with were really good, and so they were keen to up their game. And if that meant adopting AI, if there was a reason to jump onto the AI hype train, then they were much more receptive to it, as opposed to just being like, oh, just because that's the new big thing and that's hyping up on Twitter, so let's jump onto it.
Yeah, for sure. You've got to show the value for people to get interested, right? They've got to unlearn what they were doing in their day to day, and you've kind of got to cut through with some signal. And I suppose, yeah, also thinking about who your audience is. If you think about the innovation or the adoption curve, you've got your tech enthusiasts or your visionaries, then you've got people down pragmatists and laggards, and you sort of think like, am I going after the early adopters here, or am I talking to like an early majority or laggard, and how should I kind of position the conversation? And then there are some where you just go, it's not worth having the conversation yet. Just they can continue as they are. But I suppose thinking about when you're pretty close to the models, right? Like when you see the leap from one generational model to the next, and you're trying to figure out, do I jump on GPT-5? Am I really happy with the old models? Am I an Opus 4.1 guy, whatever it is? How do you think about upgrading to those different models? I'm assuming you test and experiment in some way, but how do you evaluate whether a new model is worth jumping on and adopting and leveraging as part of your workflow?
Yeah, so early on, like probably all of 2020, definitely all of 2023, and then most of 2024 as well, I'd be sort of like just like a kid on Christmas morning. Like anytime there'd be a model announcement, I'd just be like, guys, stop everything. There's like a model announcement. Let's go. Let's play with this model. Let's try it and everything. Let's see how it goes. And then pretty soon I kind of started to realize that it was kind of like a feeling of deja vu, because back in around 2014, there was this thing where with JavaScript, it was kind of like real hype at that point in time, and people were launching frameworks right, left, and center. So that's where like things like React and stuff started becoming really popular.
Mm.
And I remember like for I think a couple of years at that point in time, because I was younger, I had more energy. I tried keeping up, and then eventually I sort of like just gave up, and I was like, okay, like if I kind of had the same mindset where I was like, oh, if something is big enough, then I'll find out about it through like multiple sources, as opposed to me just jumping onto every single thing. I probably still haven't reached that level with the models, but what I have done is I've kind of scaled back in terms of trying out every single new model. I read about it, but just in terms of trying things out, because my day to day is now it's just cutting code. So the
Mm.
way I try things out is like once a model becomes available in Cursor, which is typically is pretty quickly, I'll just try it out in just my daily workflows of just generating code, debugging things, building new things, and seeing how it feels, how it goes. There's been a bunch of times where I've jumped onto models, tried them for a couple of days, be like, not quite working for me, and scaled back, and that sort of thing. Other times it's like, oh, yeah, there is a step change here. In that scenario is when I really make the jump. Otherwise, I basically just stick with what's kind of been working and just kind of play around with things, maybe in some side projects and stuff. But majority of the time, because at work I get paid to build things that work reliably, right? So I don't want to be experimenting on that time. I just want to be doing the stuff that works best as far as I'm aware at that point in time. So that's kind of like my rough philosophy for, yeah, when to jump and when to kind of like stick with something.
That's a really good point. That if you're experimenting and just getting curious at home, then you can afford to spend more time a little bit aimlessly in an experiment, which is the fun part. I think the beauty with some of these models, and whether it's a good thing or not, to be honest, is that it sort of raises the floor for the majority of people. But if you're deep into this space, I liken it to like when the new iPhones come out nowadays. You're like,
Yes.
oh, cool, great. The camera is a little bit better and the audio is better, and I can do this one new thing that adds 0.001% of benefit to my life, but at least I can talk about it. Whereas it's not like the early iPhone moment where every release was like a step change. And
Yeah.
the feelings of step change differ depending on how widely you adopt AI within your workflows, right? And I'm not a coder, so like GPT-5 was great to improve some of the writing and the speed, but I don't know how good it is for code. And from what I've heard, it's great for vibe coding. But for someone who perhaps was just frustrated with the models previously, like 4.0, then it's probably a pretty decent step change, I would imagine. And do you think about it from I evaluate from touch and feel and like the response it gives me, or are you running like a full AI evaluation process as part of the outputs?
Nah, I'm more of a vibes sort of a guy for sure. Yeah, yeah. And also like just given how much, what are they calling? They're calling it like benchmarking on Twitter. How much of that's going around? It's really hard to just trust that like just pick and choose things based on that. Plus, also going back to the point that you made about, let's say, kind of like drawing a parallel to the iPhone releases. I think at this stage, basically any of the frontier lab models, if you pick them up, chances are that like you will be getting 90% of like the output. Like there might be a 10% difference. And yeah, sure, you might be doing something where the 10% is a big thing, but for most use cases, you won't actually notice too much of a difference unless you get like, really nitpicky and you really get into your area sort of thing. So I think, yeah, like the way I think about it is like kind of like if there's a revolutionary change versus an evolutionary change, like that's when I would make the switch. But if it's like tiny increments and stuff, just a lot of it is kind of like, again, it's a bit inefficient, like just keeping on changing things. At some point, you kind of got to pick your thing and stick to it.
Yeah, so true. The shift has to be big enough to really unseat your behavior, and you have personal preference, right? Like you learn to work with different models, and then as soon as you flip, you're like, oh, I know I have to work a little bit differently that way, and that's change management internally as well, right? So what are you building at the moment? Can you give us any idea of what's kind of in the pipeline for you at the moment, personally or professionally?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of things that I've been tinkering on. So I'm working on a stealth startup, so I can't talk too much about that. So that's sort of like the day to day. But I guess on the nights and weekends, I've been tinkering around with like a bunch of things. One of the big things that I'm really, I guess, really into is the whole long-term memory aspect of things. Because like when I first started using these models, it was really cool. I was like, oh shit, it can do all this and that sort of thing. But then obviously pretty quickly, as with I think most others, when you keep using them again and again, you're like every time you start up a new chat, you're like, okay, I have to explain everything all over again and that sort of thing, who I am, what I want, what I like, what I don't like, blah, 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 all that sort of thing. So quite early on, I started to feel the need for long-term memory. I think it was just last year, actually, end of the year, when the MCP servers or the Model Context Protocol was announced by Anthropic. And as part of that original release, they had a memory server in there. And so that's something that I connected to my Claude desktop app and I started using that. And over time, it started building memories about, what I liked, what I didn't like, the topics I was interested in, the research I was doing, and so on and so forth. And so what I did was I took that and started building upon it and just expanding the capability of that so that I have my own memory management server that's connected to my, like other apps that I use, like Notion and stuff as well. There's a whole like UI that's in there that I can use to kind of look at the memories that are being created. If something's off, I can manually go in and edit and that sort of stuff. And since then, there's also been really interesting like research sort of like projects that have come out around the memory space that try to tackle a lot of the issues that have then also come up as more and more people have started to use memory. So I think ChatGPT released memory maybe so like I want to say in Q1 this year or maybe a little bit earlier. And I think in the last few months is when once people actually started to see the memory kick in, once it built up in a thing, I've started to actually see people complain about the memory and about context rot and how, like they sometimes just wish that they could turn memory off and so on and so forth. And that just goes to show that if OpenAI, who are sort of like one of the frontier labs, if they're struggling with it, then that means that it's actually a big problem that's still unsolved. Like there's no sort of like, yeah, there's state of the art from a benchmarks point of view again, but when you actually start to use it, very quickly you'll start to realize that it's doing things that are just unintuitive from a human point of view.
Yeah, you're right. There's almost two sides to that coin, right? Because once it understands me and knows my context, it becomes my personal agent or assistant. And then the switching costs of moving to another frontier model are really challenging. I suppose you've got your own setup where you can probably just hook it into different models, so it doesn't really matter. But for the kind of layman's, it gets stored up within GPT, and when sort of Claude and Gemini improve their memory capabilities, then it's going to be hard to move off of it. And you sort of create like a user lock-in for some of those bigger businesses.
Exactly. I'm glad you kind of like mentioned that because I was going off on like a random tangent rant. But that was my point with mentioning the MCPs as well. Because for me, that was one of the reasons why I was like, oh shit, a MCP memory server makes a lot of sense because MCP, what it allows is that it allows these models to kind of have a way to start connecting to the data that's in the outer world without having explicit APIs and stuff. So if you had a MCP server that had all your memories, then what that meant is like, yeah, I could use Claude right now, but then I could use ChatGPT, I could use Gemini. And so, it kind of gives me the portability plus it's my memories. So I want to be able to control that. And yes, yeah, through the chats and stuff, like now ChatGPT is building memories, Claude's building memories and stuff like that. But like ideally I would completely own the memories, but that's not a real world thing. So at least I should be able to take my memories with me if I choose to move to another platform. And so
Yeah.
that's sort of like the angle that I'm looking at it from, and that's kind of what I'm tinkering with at this stage.
how do you manage? Because I would imagine you have memory for personal and even fragments of your own personal life that you want to show up in certain interactions with AI. Then you've got your professional or business memory, which those are quite different elements to think about. And again, there's probably different fragments of both that can be quite detailed. Like, how do you separate those two out? Do you bother separating the two? Do you not mind that they mix together?
Yeah, so I think for my personal solution, I actually try not to separate them out. And the reason being is that I'm sort of like working towards, and because again, I'm like the solo customer for it at this point in time. So I don't mind working towards it from the point of view of looking at that promise in like, 5, 10 years, there will be memory systems that will be able to just take it all and they'll be able to work with it all. But I think if I was to try and use something at work today and build something at work today, yeah, the sort of like the enterprise use case versus the personal use case would be quite different. Because personally, I just wanted to kind of like get a feel for and know the kind of person I am, the interests that I have and the things that I'm into. So it's a lot of things that can be like that don't have to be explicitly told to it. It can almost infer from our conversations. Whereas at work, especially for me, right? Like if I come up with like a code snippet or if I have got like a specific document that I want to store, I don't want that to be inferred. I don't want that to be like, sort of like summarized or anything like that unnecessarily. So it's different types of things. Again, at work, I would probably be dealing with a lot more numbers and data and that sort of stuff. We don't want to touch that. Need to be able to understand that and like extract insights from that while having the original raw data. Whereas with personal stuff, I talk about like a lot of crap that I forget myself, and I don't really want my LLM assistant to remember either. But the general vibe of it, I wanted to remember. So
Got
yeah,
it.
if I was building something production ready today, I would keep them separate. But for me personally, at the moment, I'm just trying to mix it up just so that I can see where the seams are, where things start to fall apart. And that's sort of like the edge that I want to be kind of working on.
Does that mean that you use, like RAG models or systems to make sure that the AI is more accurate for, as you say, business type use cases where you don't want it to hallucinate or summarize? Is that part of the framework?
Yeah, so for like if I was doing it purely for a work or enterprise sort of setting, RAG would be one part of it, where essentially what we would be doing is taking things and creating embeddings out of them. So it's essentially like number forms of, let's say, a piece of memory, so that then when I do a query, it can be turned into a number, and whatever it matches the closest top 5 things, it pulls and uses that as the context, right? So that's actually the underlying layer for both personal and professional stuff.
Right.
Because let's say like I talk about like, oh, what are my hobbies? It happens to be that like one of my hobbies is working out. So it needs to be able to realize that my questions about hobbies and then find that semantically there's this bunch of hobbies and pull everything, all of that out. So that applies in the personal context as well and applies obviously in the work context. But in the work context, I think there's a lot of like just kind of old school like database type storage as well, where here's this bit of information. We do not want to tamper with this. We just want to save this as it is. And so please do that. So that sort of thing is a bit different.
Interesting, interesting. There's a whole rabbit hole to kind of go down in that space. But
Yes.
I'd be curious, changing topics here. You're a traditional engineer turned AI engineer, and I'd be curious, the whole vibe coding saga, rate, craze, momentum, whatever you want to call it, era. What do you make of it all? Like, where do you think it starts and stops, and how does it play a role as part of engineering teams moving forward and sort of people like myself who can spin something up and struggled to deploy it to production, I'll be honest, but at least prototyping is partway there. Like, how do you build it into your workflow and where do you see it being really successful?
Yeah, lots of questions there, and like that whole space is super interesting. So I didn't realize this, but literally like from when I started using Cursor on personal projects, I was vibe coding for like I think as long as I can remember. I just didn't know the name for it. And then Andre Karpathy came up with that famous tweet, and that's where like the term was born.
Hmm.
Now, vibe coding is really interesting because I personally found it very, very hard not to vibe code.
Okay.
And the reason being is because again, it goes back to that thing that we talked about of me being sort of like that lazy engineer type, where it's like if I can just because I have an idea of like what I want. And the sort of like pre 2023, the barrier between what I wanted and what I had, or like what I had in my mind and what I actually wanted was to be able to type some characters on the computer, right? And then have those compile and then have it deploy and have it run. Now all of a sudden there's this shortcut in the middle where I can just kind of like use English instead of Python or Ruby or whatever it is, and actually just talk about what I want. And if I can describe it with enough detail, the generated aspect of it, or the generated product of it, should actually work fairly close to what I'm expecting. And that works pretty well in most cases. But when you are like when it is your day job to be an engineer and build things, the problem is that then it's also your day and night job to be able to support those things when they break. And
Right.
I think that's kind of where vibe coding started. Like essentially, like that's kind of like a no vibe coding zone for me. Where
Right.
if it's something that I'm gonna have to be supporting, if it's something that it's in production, there's like more than one user relying on it, and if it breaks and I need to fix it, I need to understand exactly how it's built, exactly how it works, so that I can then jump in and fix it at any point in time, right?
Got it.
And so that's kind of where I think we're at. I believe we're gonna kind of like get to the point fairly quickly where even that part is not really a big problem, and you can sort of like wipe code through that as well. But at this stage, I don't think we're quite there yet. And so that's kind of where I stop wipe coding. That's where I focus on just trying to code. But even then, I don't actually do a lot of the typing myself.
Mm.
It's a lot of then kind of like defining the constraints really tightly and making sure that whatever the code is that's being generated, I understand what it is, why it is the way it is, and then any potential downsides to it. And the great thing about LLMs is that they're really good at all of those things. Sound like researchy things, and
Mm.
they're really good at that. So if you can use them for that stuff, your workflow is still 10x faster, but and it might not be like 50x faster if it would be like if you were just vibe coding purely, and you might just be getting the 10x gains up front. But on the back end, when you actually have to support it, you can end up sinking a lot of time into vibe coding things, and we've seen things go wrong with people, like their apps getting like data stolen, data deleted, all that sort of stuff. You sort of like avoid all of that if you just make sure up front you understand what's going on.
It's such a good point because when AI tools make everyone as equally productive or intelligent or capable in theory, the only kind of competitive moat as an engineer or a builder is your ability to judge the quality of inputs or outputs. And
Yeah.
that's not just the build of the model, but also the product, but also the maintenance and management of that product moving forward. And as you say, you can have an element of confidence that it's going to spit out some pretty good code, but you still need to know how to unpack that and what it means and sort of,
Mhm.
shape it around the edges to make sure that that quality control gets maintained from whatever's produced from cursor, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, for sure. And I think in terms of like that thing that you mentioned where like having LLM tools becomes the baseline, and the thing that differentiates you is like when the LLM tools can't solve something,
That's it.
then you figure that out. And so that's, yeah. And so to be able to do that, you sort of have to understand what it is that they're actually doing. Because again, it gives you that intuitive feel of like, oh, typically this is kind of where they would take a wrong turn. And then things would kind of like compound from there.
That's it. Knowing, having been an engineer for years, you understand the principles and frameworks to think through and triage, and that's what it's exciting for kind of newcomers to the employment market because
Mm.
in theory they can upskill faster, but at the same time, if you haven't had that trial and error process for 10 years of just getting it wrong and working late to fix your mess, then you don't really know how to unpack the kind of errors of your ways. And I think, unfortunately, as well, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, we're going to see a graveyard of kind of concepts and engineering kind of failures, both of startups and personal projects and all the rest of it, which you think about the volume of kind of cloud data that consumes and controls and all the rest of it. But it's kind of mad to think the volume of output that we're starting to see and the innovation that's coming from it across the internet at the moment. And people are solving use cases all over the show that previously weren't possible to innovate through.
Yeah, for sure. And I think when we start seeing those failures and when we start seeing those errors in production, things falling over and that sort of stuff, that I think is going to act as the data for or training data for systems that will eventually be able to conquer these issues. But
Love that.
until then, I think we engineers still have a job. And yeah, it's just
It's true. You almost take him on for the team when something goes wrong, right? And then, yeah, that comes back into the loop to improve the system. And I suppose you've been in engineering for a long time, and now that you're hiring for teams or you have been hiring for individuals with AI capabilities, how do you approach that? Because that's a new muscle in itself. Like we're starting to look at building the team internally and thinking about what type of capabilities we need, but it's not necessarily a capability that folks are used to testing, hiring for, et cetera. And not to say that we throw out all the old principles of interview and putting people through questionnaire type processes, but how do you think about hiring in the age of AI for technical staff versus what you previously might have done?
yeah. So I think I have sort of like strong opinions on this. And I think it comes from my own background of not really being the best in technical interviews. I bombed like a ton of technical interviews. And then without fail, every time I work with people, I always have a great experience, and the people have a great experience as well. But just in that interview exam setting, I'm all like, I'm all thumbs kind of thing. So given that background, plus the way so my majority of my hiring experience was at Paloma during my 5 year stint as an engineering manager. And it was during the boom and then during the crash as well. And so the interesting thing was the way we would hire then was a lot more sort of like, rather than focusing on like whether this person can actually has the hard skills, it was a lot more focus on, is this a person that I can work alongside? Can I rely on them? Do they think in a way that kind of makes sense to me? Or do they think in a way that I can learn from? And sort of like maxing or kind of like, yeah, almost like optimizing more for those rather than the hard technical skills. Because even pre-AI, like I always thought that like, these things you can pick up, because that's what I do. I typically I think there's two types of people. One is the type of people who, before jumping into anything, they'll read the manual, like, and like page to page and then jump into. And then there's the type of people who kind of do what I like to call just-in-time learning, where, you sort of like, you run into a wall and you're like, there's a wall here. Okay, let me like, go to the side and then run forward. And then, okay, let me change tact. And so you learn as things come up. And that's the approach that I've taken. And so I feel like if that's the kind of people that you bring on who can learn things as they go, as the need arises, then the main thing to optimize becomes like, can you work together as part of a cohesive team?
Smart.
And then the other thing that we used to do a lot as well was just reference checks. We would really like, again, go hard on the reference checks and just make sure that like that area kind of gave us some sense for what this person has been like previously. And the other thing that actually worked really well was, and I don't think I've seen this being done too much, at least in like New Zealand and maybe even Australia, but essentially bringing people on as contractors initially. Because then, like, once you work with someone for 3 months, you really get a sense for like, there's no truer sense of like, what their capabilities are, what they're like to work with, and that sort of thing, other than like, actually working with them. So once you work with them for 3 months, you as the hiring manager or the person hiring, you'd have a pretty good sense for what they're like, what their capabilities are, what their weaknesses are. And then based on that, you can make a decision of like, okay, either we want to work together for the longer term, or let's just call it quits and let's call it a day, and that sort of thing. And then again, from the company's point of view, because the other person, the interviewee is working as a contractor, it's easy if things are not working out, if there was like a massive disconnect in the expectations and the delivery, then it's easy to kind of like just wrap things up as well, as opposed to going really hard and making it like, making like a 7-stage interview process and really losing out on candidates that would be good in the day-to-day work, but for some reason just aren't that great in the, exam settings type of thing.
Totally. I think that old era of hiring through 7 stages and going through every type of personality test that is available is just archaic, right? But yeah, I think you're exactly right that the hard skills, as you say, everyone has the same tools nowadays. It more comes down to how do you judge inputs, outputs, which is always hard to do until you're actually working with someone in theory. But the cultural fit is more important than anything. How do they communicate? How do they show up? Their enthusiasm and energy in the role is much more important, as you say, than the tools and what those hard skills are. I suppose just before we finish up, would love to know, you up for a quick fire round to show us up?
Oh yeah, for sure. Let's go for it.
Awesome. All right, ChatGPT, Claude, or Gemini?
ChatGPT, I think.
GPT-5, or are you sort of longing for the old models?
O3 was my ride or die.
Ride or die. Awesome. Most overhyped AI trend right now?
I think just the whole like agents thing, like it's just annoying the way that words get attached to like everything.
I saw a crazy stat the other day that Gartner said that of 3,000 agents or agentic business models that have been established, I think only 130 were true agents. The rest of them were just bolting on an LLM to one part of the workflow.
Exactly, yeah. Workflow is where it's at. Basically, it's that Scooby-Doo meme where, agent, and then you take the mask off and it's just the workflow with, a couple of Google searches or something like that.
Totally. Open source models or closed proprietary?
Closed, yeah. In terms of using.
Yeah, fair enough. One New Zealand company quietly doing great work in AI.
I think I would have to give a shout out to Paloma. Yeah, they work with a lot of ventures, and so they're not just working. It's not just one company. It's actually a whole bunch of companies that they're kind of like being the base layer for and powering. And so yeah, hopefully we'll see some awesome stuff from them.
Wicked. And what's your parting recommendation for people who are just getting started? And maybe let's do it for the technical crowd. What's your recommendation for them to get going in AI?
I'd say just just jump in, and it's kind of like, it's trite, but jump in and start using it. And if you come across a scenario where, it hallucinates or it does something that you're like, this is useless, maybe just literally just go to Google and just be like, it did this. How do I stop it from doing this? Because at this point, LLMs have been around for like a couple of years now. And so there are a set of, if not best practices, at least mid practices that you can use to get reasonable outputs or work around some issues. And once you start spending time with it, then if you are a technical person, as with any tool, you'll start to understand what the tool is for, where it works, where it doesn't work, more importantly. And then you can start pattern matching with your daily workflow and knowing that, the tool can fit here, or it can go here. This is probably not a great place. So
great recommendation. Use AI to find out how to work with AI. It's kind of as simple as that, really, isn't it?
Just awesome. Getting people in it. Yeah,
exactly. Well, thank you, Hitarth, for joining us today. And thank you to our listeners. Please subscribe to the channel for weekly episodes and to hear more from the people building New Zealand's AI future. Thanks for tuning in to the AI Corner.